Hello, I'm Robert, voluntary fact checker, and helping if you're scared of many things, and also helping you to see through all the clickbait and exaggeration and hyperbole. So, at the end of the last video, I was talking about how Trump's using a kind of dual approach, which doesn't seem to be much appreciated by many people. That Witkoff, he is not really, he's certainly not deciding the final version of the treaty or anything like that. And it seems that basically Witkoff's role is to be the salesperson to sell the deal to Putin. And Rubio's goal is to make sure that it actually is a sensible treaty and all the negotiating and working out the details. That's Rubio on the US side and not really Witkoff's role. So that's as I understand it. And it's Rubio is the one who was talking to the Ukrainians and making sure, and Witkoff was very much somewhat uncomfortable in that situation because it's not really what he's good at. So that's what I was just saying at the end of the last video. And I'm just going now back a little bit. So I'll start talking about that. So the Ukrainians are now, we've got Umarov leads the Ukrainian team, and Ushakov is one of the Russians, so it's a little bit of a very similar name to Western, to English speakers. But anyway, Umarov now leads the Ukrainian team. And he said the US was super positive, and Rubio, not just about peace deals, it's a pathway that leaves Ukraine sovereign, independent, and prosperous. So that is how the US is thinking, with Rubio being still quite firmly in charge. He'll be leaving, sadly, from Ukraine's point of view, he'll be leaving his job I think in January. But for now, he's leading, and he's really much more understanding of the Ukrainian point of view. And President Trump he talks about working on minute details of the front line. They can't be along a highway or through a house, etc. When Trump was asked about what the disputes were about. That also would fit in. That's my paraphrase of what he said. That, but because that would again suggest that when they're talking about some things that Russia can't accept at all, and some things, it might be much more detailed things that all this disputing is about than the media reporting it. It's hard to know what it's all about until we actually hear, if they actually say. We may not know until ceasefire is agreed, if there's one. So yesterday, Ukrainians were very positive, and I've never known in the entire history since the war started. I'm not saying that there's going to be a ceasefire, but what I'm saying is that Ukrainians have never been as positive as this about it. And so I think that's quite hopeful. And just going to say just very briefly about the corruption scandal, then Yermak is not he's not involved, he's not accused. If they had turned up evidence against Yermak, then we would know by now. So no, it's obvious they haven't. And so Yermak, there's quite interesting history behind this, but I don't know if I should go into just now, just to say, well, just very briefly, Zelensky appointed Yermak because Yermak told, this was before the war started, Yermak told Zelensky that he's got good contacts high up in Russia. And Zelensky, as a comedian, he often performed in Moscow. He got very good, he got lots, that's where his career was launched, essentially, in Moscow. And he got rave reviews from the Russians watching his act, his comedy act. And that's what got him started in his comedy company. So Zelensky has a great deal of lots of contacts in Russia, and he's Russian speaking himself, and all the way through to the day the war started, then Zelensky believed that he could achieve peace with Putin just by talking to him. So he was actually had similar views back then to what Trump has right now. He thought that we just need to talk to Russia and we'll achieve peace. But sadly that didn't happen. And one of the things he said is that if we can get the shooting to stop, then we'll have peace, or something to that effect. And so his aim was to get a proper ceasefire in Donbass, and that was his focus from 2019 all the way through to when Russia suddenly invaded and shocked him and shocked Macron in February 2022. So that's the background here. It's not reported very well at all. And the his name is just Yermak. Yes, Yermak was the key architect of that approach. And as a result, Zelensky hadn't even got the Ukrainians to build fortifications around Mariupol. It's partly why the Russians could get in so easily and could take Mariupol, is because the Ukrainians never built fortifications around it, because they were sure that Russia was not going to invade. So it's all very back to front to the way that Zelensky is so often portrayed by especially people in the far right. But that's the truth. And so since the war started, then Zelensky has simply seen no opportunity for a ceasefire or peace deal. And so that's why he's been fighting. And then for the last year, until recently, until the end of 2024, Ukrainians thought they'd be able to take back the occupied areas and even Crimea if they got enough help from the Allies. But that help never came. So the various things that they needed, and they always got the things, so the things that Ukraine got in 2024 could have help from its allies, which the allies already had in 2023 and in 2022, would have been enough for Ukraine to do a counter-offensive in 2023. What they got in 2023 would have been enough in 2022. What they got in 2025 would have been enough for a very successful counter-offensive in 2024. That's the way it's been all the way through the war. And if Ukraine had in 2022 what it has now, there's no way that Russia could have done anything at all, really. It couldn't have invaded. So that's basically how the war has been progressing, that Ukraine always gets too little, too late for a counter-offensive, but just enough to stop Russia from advancing or to slow down Russia's advance. And at the moment, if Trump was to give Ukraine the Tomahawks, and then Ukraine believes that they could stop the war right away, and with a ceasefire, just force Russia into a very favourable ceasefire for the Ukrainians. But Trump is not prepared to sell them to Ukraine. Ukraine's willing to give good money to the United States for the Tomahawks, but the United States won't sell. So that's the situation. So the thing that's very positive for people who are scared about Putin attacking NATO is that Putin can't attack, that Putin is constantly trying to pressure the United States not to give to Ukraine things that obviously the United States has thousands of Tomahawks, and Putin is scared that Trump might give Ukraine 100 Tomahawks. So how could Putin have any idea of attacking NATO? It makes no sense whatsoever. It's just his way of turning words around and make you think things that don't make sense. He's got a way of making people illogical somehow. Maybe my logic training is just too I'm too trained in logic to be affected. It doesn't affect me at all. And that's partly why I see things a little bit differently from many people, because I'm not affected by logic in the way that most people are. It's just completely illogical, the way that Putin's propaganda. And I don't really quite understand why people are affected by it, but they are, obviously. So So that's the situation that the Ukrainians are very positive about these prospects for a ceasefire, and the important thing to realize is that for Ukrainians, so Trump, in a way, he just wants a deal in a way. I think Trump is quite a superficial approach to it in a way. He wants to get the deal across the line. He'd be very happy if he could get a ceasefire that lasts to the end of his term. So he remains in office, and I don't think he cares much about after he leaves office. For the Ukrainians, though, they want a ceasefire that will last for their children's and their grandchildren, so their grandchildren, great-grandchildren can grow up in a peaceful, prosperous Ukraine. So it's a very different perspective, and I think Europeans are somewhat between the two. They want a ceasefire that would last for at least a few years into the future, maybe a decade or something. So I think you've got these different perspectives. The United States very short-sighted, the Ukrainians longer sighted, the Europeans a little bit longer term. I think the Europeans are really quite long term, and the Ukrainians, they just don't want this ever to happen again. So someone in Ukraine who's sort of maybe in their 40s now, if you go back to 1994, the Budapest Agreement, then suppose they were 10 in 1994. No, suppose they were 20 in 1994. Then in 2014, they would be 40. And that's when Russia invaded Crimea. And now in 2025, they'd be 49. No, 51. And so someone who's 51, they have experienced Russia taking over Crimea, and they might have been living in Crimea, and they fled to Ukraine. Then they have experienced Russia invading Ukraine, and then fighting a war for 3 years, getting on for 4 years. And so, they've lived through, when he invaded Ukraine, Zelensky was telling everyone, look, we're arranging peace. The Russians are peaceful people. They're never going to invade us. We know how to talk to them. Yermak was saying, look, I've got lots of friends in Moscow, and I've kind of persuaded them towards peace, and everything is peaceful and lovely. And then suddenly, shockingly for them, they are attacked from the sea in the south, from the Russia directly over the border in the east, from the north. And at that point, nobody in it must have been just utterly shocking when they discovered that the tanks had driven over the border into Kharkiv, and the first casualty of the war, they just shot a border guard dead, who tried to told the tanks not to let them in. Said the tanks were not permitted to drive through the gate, and they just shot it. And that's when basically the start of the war. And then there were people, Russians, special agents in the cities going around shooting people, and just suddenly it was no longer safe in Ukraine when they've been used to being safe, and just some sporadic shelling going on in eastern Donbass. So that's the background to this, that they don't trust Putin's promises anymore. They didn't trust the Budapest Agreement, then the Crimea thing, and then the two Minsk Accords, which were promises not to do this sort of thing, and then suddenly he's attacking in this all-out war. So if Putin now, so they can't just accept a promise now. If you try and take the Ukraine's perspective, they're just not going to be convinced. If Putin just say, I pinky swear that I'm not going to invade you again, they're not going to accept that. So that is why, and it doesn't matter, even if Zelensky, for some reason, got all soft and kind-hearted and sort of peaceful, full of peace, and he just thought, I'm sure Putin feels like me too, and he'll just agree to peace, and we can trust him, everything is fine. And even if he felt like that, he couldn't do it, because the Ukrainian people would not agree with him. and he's the leader of the Ukrainian people. So they have to have adequate security guarantees, and they have to be sure that these security guarantees won't just work now. So there's no point in a promise of security guarantees that will last for a few years, but like with the Budapest Agreement, 20 years from now, all the people who made those promises, then their governments have been led to other governments and other governments and other governments, 3-4 times, and they're no longer helping Ukraine. So the Ukrainians need something better than the Budapest Agreement, which is just basically a kind of promise that that they would be supportive in a way. They need something much more substantive than just a kind of promise that they'd be on their side in a supportive way, but something really concrete. And so that's why there's so much focus by Ukrainians on the security guarantees. It's not because they want to be aggressive, it's because they want the peace to last. And they want the peace to last for a very long time. And indeed, they want the peace to never stop. They just want the same peace that we have in the rest of NATO. So that's why they want to join NATO, but they can't do that because Trump, for one, will block it for right to the end of his term at least. A future president might permit it, but Trump won't. So they have to build a mini version of NATO inside Ukraine. So NATO, all these countries, all these 300 million in the United States and even more in Europe and Canada, all added together, then about 600 million or something I think they've got in NATO. And Ukraine, with its 40 million people, has to try to be as good a deterrent for Russia as the rest of NATO put together. So that's why they need to keep their army quite big, and they need to have lots of equipment to help deal with the disparity in size of the population by having a very large amount of very good equipment. So that's basically why the Ukrainians are so keen on these security guarantees and why they keep talking about it over and over. Because they've got to build a miniature version of NATO inside Ukraine that's sufficient to stop Russia from ever invading again. And so that's what's going on with the security guarantees. And the Ukrainians believe they can achieve this. So, and then now these are my previous 1960s level of detail Ukraine news with. It's just remind that the 1960s level of detail was actually the very few days when this would actually even have featured on the news in the 1960s. We only had 15-20 minutes a day of news. Repeated on some days, with slightly extended edition might be 20 minutes. And just maybe twice a day. And in that, the Ukraine story on most days wouldn't be featured at all. And even today, I doubt it, based on the amount of that there was in the BBC on other topics, and in the BBC at least, I think it would just be a minute or two. And that would be in it. That's all you'd have found out. And you had no way of finding out anything else, except you could get the papers. The papers weren't up to date. They were printed the previous evening, and most people didn't read the papers in great detail. They just flick to a section that interests them and then leave it, and then just throw it away. We didn't have recycling back then. So anyway, so this is far more detail than you could ever have had in the 1960s. Anyone, no matter, unless it would be impossible to get access this level of detail. I don't think anyone could have back in the 1960s, even experts. So anyway, so the White House is very optimistic for an end to the war. This is just before the meeting, and so we'll see what they say after it. And this is about, this is very positive before. And if you keep going back, this was not reported well in the news, but this is what's really been going on. So now, Russia says no change since the Anchorage summit. This keeps coming up. So the Anchorage summit, when Putin and Trump met, it ended at the press briefing. They had no agreed consensus. They hadn't reached a consensus on anything. So the two leaders gave separate talks, and they didn't receive any questions from the public, and then they went their separate ways. And since then, Putin then after that claimed that he had achieved a secret consensus with Trump, and Trump said there's no deal until there is a deal, and he didn't agree with Putin on that. They didn't directly disagree. He just said there's no deal until there is a deal. And based on those two statements, the Russians keep saying that there has been no change since the agreement was made during the Anchorage summit. Since there was no agreement, then Russia can say that no matter what this final agreement is, because there's no text for the Anchorage summit. So if you hear Russia saying that, it makes them seem very inflexible, but in reality, it's they can fit that to almost anything that they might eventually decide. They just say, look, this is what we agreed secretly during Anchorage, and since Trump doesn't say they agreed to anything, then there's nobody's going to object. So that's all that is about. This is about how I just talked here about how quite a number of different things. The way that Trump was talking suggested they're talking about small swaps along the front line. I talked about how you might do it. You draw a line like that looks at the direction that the Ukrainians are going and the direction the Russians are going, and you kind of smooth it out and you look at where they might be in a few weeks. So this little pocket of Pokrovsk, and since this map, then that's pretty much filled in, but there's a little gap about Mernahard there, and in this area, it's still grey area there, but it's pretty much closed off there. Grey area is disputed between the two sides. It hasn't really changed a lot since then. And if you just go back. So there's been loads of, so these are my summaries of what they've been actually saying. So now, I just want to see, so if Russia agrees to this treaty, they're not going to get the fortress belt. So some of the things we can know about this treaty, that if they do agree to it, they simply, and then they will claim they never expected to get the fortress belt, and they will not get this stop Ukraine from joining NATO, and Russia will claim they never made it a condition. So that's the way that Russia deals with this sort of situation, and people have very short memories, and they don't seem to even notice. But Russia is constantly saying that it never said something that a few weeks before it actually was saying, and nobody seems to notice. So don't worry about all these intransigencies, because that's how Russia copes with it. It just changes and tells everyone it hasn't changed. And most people believe them because they don't have a good memory of what Russia said a couple of weeks ago. And that's basically how Russia does this. I mean, most people forget the news from last week. They couldn't really tell you much about it this week. So what Russia could get is that Trump can promise never approve Ukrainian membership of NATO, and Ukraine can concede Pokrovsk to Russia and other concessions along the front line of the details. They can have a general amnesty of almost all actions except war crimes. A treaty can't have an amnesty for war crimes. It's not a valid treaty, or that part of it is not valid if it does that. They can extend the START to a treaty on nuclear weapons, all sanctions lifted stage by stage, and various economic incentives from the United States. Then Russia, from its side, no matter what happens, will claim that it denazified Ukraine and will claim that it achieved all the objectives of the special operation. And then the war's over. And then these are legally impossible things. So it can't block access of Ukraine to NATO. I'll talk about that in the final video. So I'll just talk about legally impossible things. And I'll start here and repeat that in the final video because it's getting a little bit long. So I'll do a third video on that bit.